He took me by the arm and dragged me to the window. "Look!" He spat with an outward finger against the glass. Far beyond the covered pool sat the gazebo, lifeless and weather-worn with noticeable chips in its white paint. Only its right side was visible from behind the rest of the house. I could see the flags encircling its beams, waving calmly above a row of gardening supplies. James was breathing heavily as he stared out at it, his eyes fixed even as he spoke. "He built it right after she disappeared, and we're not allowed to use it, calls it his garden. I climbed it once when I was 10 and he beat the crap out of me, but I've seen him out there at night a couple times, spraying the plants, fixing the dirt. And look!" He hurried to his dresser and rummaged through before pulling something out and jamming it into my gut. I reached down. It was a dirty purple bracelet, all stretchy and rubber. It had Mikayla's name on it. I played with it in my hand. "Remy dug that up last year," said James, "dropped it right at my feet, and I remember it. I remember her wearing it that night." I stared at it and let it slide down onto my wrist, trying to find any counter to his theory. "You saw her drive off," I reminded him. "I saw her car drive off." There was a voice in the back of my mind telling me he was delusional, but the voice that believed him was louder and much more afraid. I watched, mouth agape, as he struggled to tie his shoes. He kept messing up and starting over, spitting more curses under his breath. My thoughts were swirling. "James, why haven't you called the police?" "Because I can't." It was louder than he'd intended. He stood up and recollected himself. "My dad is friends with the sheriff. If a cop pulls up, he'll kill us. If I run, he'll kill my mom. I don't even think she'd believe me." I put my hands up to quiet him, but the fearful cry he'd been holding in had burst out. He covered his mouth to push it back in, along with the snot and tears that were oozing out of him. He rushed over to his bedside drawer and picked up a bottle of pills, swiftly popping a few into his mouth. My chest was getting tighter. "Why can't we just play along a little longer?" I said. "I'll leave tonight." "If we go downstairs, we're dead. We were dead the second you got here. The police, the news, they'll all be here tomorrow whether you're here or not. They could find her. I could tell them. My dad might snap like he did on Mikayla. You don't understand. He'd rather die than get caught. And he'd take us with him. I know it. So we need to go. Out the window now. We'll just run." At that point, it no longer mattered to me if James was right or if he was out of his freaking mind. I wanted to get out of there. I looked out the window again. It was starting to get dark. I would have preferred a more casual escape over jumping off the roof. But if what he was saying was true, then we had no choice. I was craving a cigarette more than ever, and that alone was almost enough to get me on that roof. "We could take a bus," I said. "It's how I got here. It's only a couple of miles that way." "I know where it is. We just have to stay off the roads. We can use the fields for cover, and then once we—" There was a knock on the door. "James!" It was Paul. He tried turning the handle. "Everything all right in there?" Without hesitation, James ran for the window and opened it. I could hear the faint chime of the alarm from somewhere out in the hall. Paul's jiggling of the locked door grew more aggressive. "What the hell is going on in there? Open the door!" When he started pounding on it, I threw on my bag and joined James, who was already halfway out the window. Together, we scurried on the roof, hopped onto the back porch, and dropped down onto the rather large portico above the back door. I'd almost fallen down the side, but James held me up. A loud crash came booming from back up in his room. I looked up. "Don't stop!" James yelled. He jumped first onto the lawn, and I followed. Both of my feet and knees took the impact hard, the ground underneath the autumn foliage deceptively solid. James helped me up, and we took off running. Against his advice, I looked back and saw Paul peeking out James's window. He shouted to us and then disappeared. James had already separated himself a good distance from me. I kept pushing my legs as he called back for me to do so, my backpack bouncing off my butt with each stride. There was a road in the distance, the same road I'd trudged along to get here. I could see where it met the orange and purple sky. It felt like it was never getting any closer. A gunshot rang loud, ripping across the plains. Paul was now standing by the back door, aiming a rifle in our direction, his cries chasing us behind the gunpowder. Another bang and my legs buckled. When I'd reached the gazebo, I hid behind it to catch my breath. There was a sharp, debilitating pain in my side. I held myself up on one of the railings and thought I could feel my heartbeat vibrating against the wood. I swore if I'd survived this, I would quit smoking. I peeked around the corner and saw Paul hurry into the garage, James calling out for me by the road. But as I stood there frozen against the gazebo, flags caressing my shoulder, I thought about the girl buried underneath. What if James was right? What if nobody ever found Mikayla's remains? What if we didn't make it out of there and nobody ever knew? I thought of my own story, unheard and not believed. When I told my dad what my uncle had done all those years, he hit me. I couldn't let this story stay buried, too. I took out my lighter and lit a flag, and then another. The fire burned slowly, picking up quick as it caught onto more flags and dream catchers, then down to the plants below. I stumbled back and watched the flames spread and dance along the darkening sky. I hoped, at the very least, it would be a distraction, and more so enough to attract law enforcement. I could hear Linda's shrill voice crying out at the sight of it. She'd rushed around the side of the house with groceries in her hands, calling out for her husband who had just sped off in his truck. He was coming. I made one last dash for James, who was impatiently waving me on. He took my arm and led me across the road his father would soon be turning onto. We slipped into the cornfield and kept going until we heard the roar of an engine pass by. We froze until there was nothing but the wind, the pain in my side still nagging me. As dark as the sky had rapidly grown, it was even darker in that field, the corn towering over us, clinging to life as much as we were. Paul's headlights were shining through from not much farther ahead. We waited in terror for a crunch or a shout, or ideally for the truck to zoom off. Another gunshot rang high into the air. I gasped and had to cover my mouth to quiet my breathing. "What are you doing with my son?" Paul called in a sing-songy fashion. We could hear him walking about over the sound of his engine purring. "Where the hell are you?" His footsteps wandered around, farther, closer, then farther again, separated only by the sound of swishing corn as he searched randomly along the outer edge. There was a pause, followed by a door slamming shut. Paul's truck whirled and sped back down the road. I exhaled as James tugged on my arm and instructed to keep going. We pushed through more corn and followed along the road as best as we could. I never would have imagined being in this situation when I'd walked down it earlier that day. Now I was wishing I never had. Sirens suddenly wailed nearby and eventually rushed past us. The glow of the flames had grown noticeably brighter in the distance, the smoke visible high above the fields. "Holy crap," James gasped. "Come on, we need to keep moving. Are you okay?" "Yeah," I wasn't. We shuffled farther through the corn, shoving it aside more aggressively as we went. I could hardly see more than a few feet in front of me. After a while, we could hear a steady buzz of passing vehicles, indicating that we'd reached the city, but also the end of the cornfields. We stepped out onto a road and into the glow of streetlights. I felt like I could breathe again for just a moment. "You ready?" he said. "We gotta move quick, but we gotta blend in." I'd realized in that moment how truly young James was and how insane I was for having put my life in his hands. I was 28, but felt just like the same little girl I was all those years ago, hoping her father would protect her. I'd only hoped James was better at it. We dashed across an empty street and then slipped into the downtown area. I kept my head down. Most of the businesses on the strip were closed for the night, but the bar I'd seen earlier was now glowing in its neon signs, which did a good job masking its otherwise unapproachable facade. There were locals standing outside having a smoke, drunkenly arguing about nothing. James and I crossed the street, and when we reached the bus station, I was relieved to see the lights were still on. This relief would not last. "Incoming only, folks," the man at the desk told us. "You'll have to wait until morning, sorry." I was already making my way for the exit. James caught up with me. "What are you doing?" "I'm getting the hell out of here." "What am I supposed to do?" He followed alongside me, being more conspicuous than I would have liked. I stopped and leaned in close. "I don't freaking care. Come with me or don't. I'm leaving." I was on the verge of crying, the lump in my throat growing larger. James stood there at a complete loss. I looked at him and saw the 5-year-old boy who woke up that night all alone, the streetlights above shining in his eyes like the headlights he'd watched disappear. "I'm sorry," I added. "I just want to go home." I couldn't believe I had said it, and meant it. Then I realized James couldn't go home. If my fire failed, he was going to be on his own, on the run and homeless at 17, just like I was. "They're going to find Mikayla," I assured him. "Then you'll be safe." He was trembling. What if they don't? I had no answer, not one he would have liked anyway. Even if we'd made a call to the police that very moment, I could already see Paul going home and putting the rifle to Linda's head before putting it in his mouth. I'd wondered if he already had. I think James did too. He leaned into me and started to cry. He was a whole foot taller than me and bony, but I held on to him. Not like I had with Paul or Linda, but with Ernest. "Excuse me?" A voice suddenly called out to us. I was about to run when I saw a familiar face. The old man I'd smoked with earlier was approaching us from the mechanics lot next to us. His face twisted when he recognized me back. "Oh, it's you! Abby, right? Everything all right over here?" James and I looked at each other but said nothing. An idea crossed my mind. "Actually, no, sir. We're stuck here, too." The man, whose name I'd forgotten, grinned. "Huh. Well, car's fixed. I'm about to head out if you guys need a lift. Where you headed?" "Anywhere," I begged. His smile faded. "Right, okay, sure, that's fine. I'm going to be driving west down 80 for a while if that works for y'all." "Yes," I said. "That's perfect." James and I followed the man back to the lot and hopped into his old station wagon. I took the front. I thanked the old man repeatedly, even offered him gas money, but he refused it, said he was happy to help. He introduced himself to a catatonic James in back, reminding me his name was Frank. My eyes kept darting between Frank's and the rearview mirror he was periodically checking. James was huffing short, panicked breaths. I'd wondered if he needed his meds. We drove in silence for a while. You couldn't see anything beyond the headlight's path, just a deep, empty void. The old man tried to spark up conversation, but neither James nor I were up for it. He'd asked if we wanted the radio on or off, if we were hungry, if we were cold, hot. Each time I told him we were fine. He took the hint, and we drove for hours down the same stretch of highway, having barely spoken, until James had fallen asleep. "I know it ain't my business, young lady, but are you sure you and your friend are okay?" Frank kept his voice just above the hum of the radio. I assured him once more that we were fine, even though my mind was still back on Lincoln Ave, wondering what had been happening that very moment at the Murray household. If the flames revealed the truth below, or if they were extinguished before they got the chance. I played an imagined scene in my mind over and over. The fire trucks, the inspection of the damage, Paul watching eagerly nearby, ready to run. The discovery of bones, the call to the sheriff, the arrest of the man he'd known and tried to help all those years ago, or whom he might now have to hunt down. "Will you at least tell me your real name?" Frank asked, bringing me back to reality. We had so clearly been withholding truth from this poor man. All he wanted was just a small piece of it, maybe so he could justify the crazy thing he had done that day. I looked down at my fidgeting hands and noticed the purple bracelet still tight along my wrist, the pink lettering of Mikayla's name flashing with every passing streetlight. I'd forgotten that I was still wearing it. I thought about how badly I wanted to give her the ending she deserved, the one she'd wanted for herself, an escape, freedom, how easy it would have been to do it, to say her name. "It's Rachel," I uttered instead. Frank smiled at me. "Well, Rachel, it's nice to finally meet you." I let him drive us another hour. It was almost midnight. When I woke James to get out, he jumped. I had Frank drop us off at a cheap bed and breakfast, something I'd grown quite accustomed to over the years. I tried once more to pay him, but he wound up giving me money instead. It wasn't much, but the gesture alone was beyond kind. In spite of everything I'd been through that day and all that came before it, it wasn't any less meaningful coming across someone as genuinely good as that man. I felt bad that I'd lied to him about my name again. James and I shared a bed, sleeping head to toe beside a rattling air conditioner. I wouldn't have slept anyway. I was plenty happy with the 4 hours I got. When I woke early the following morning, I stepped outside for a cigarette and enjoyed every moment of it. I'd quit another day. James was sitting up in bed by the time I went back inside, his hair an awful mess, his tired eyes red. He'd asked me what our plan was. He was impatient, and I understood. I told him that we should eat breakfast first and figure it out from there. It had almost been an entire day since I'd eaten last. When we entered the dining area, we saw that there were only a few other guests inside. I still wanted a table in back, but James insisted we sit by the bar where a TV was playing the news. I gave in. He was worried about his mother, and I couldn't blame him for that. I'd have been worried about mine, too, if she were still alive. I was really hoping this aspect of our lives remained different. James was glued to the TV, even as the waitress came and took our order. "You're going to drive yourself crazy," I told him as she walked away. He shook his head at me and kept his eyes fixed. We sat in silence as we waited for our food and potential news. "Your coat," James suddenly recalled. "You left your coat at my house." I laughed, to which James blinked. "It's not my coat." I explained. "Whose is it?" "Some guy named Scott, I think. Maybe Jordan." It wasn't long before the waitress arrived with our meals. We'd ordered the same thing, only my eggs were scrambled. There was something about the smell of bacon and home fries that brought comfort strong enough to make you forget that you were on the run. I moaned at the first bite. Probably could have eaten both plates. I even thought I saw a moment of calm in James's face as he ate. The TV caught our attention. "Thank you, John. Authorities say they responded early last night to a fire in one very familiar Indiana home. The home of Mikayla Murray." James nearly fell out of his seat. I dropped my fork and a home fry fell on the floor. Missing since 2008, Mikayla's disappearance was one that rocked the small town of Millersburg, Indiana, but left many hopeful that she was still out there listening. But when authorities found her car abandoned near the Elkhart River, just miles from her home, friends and family began to fear the worst. Mikayla was gone, her whereabouts never discovered, until now. I wanted to turn back to James, but was afraid of the look on his face. When authorities cleared the scene last night at 1108 Lincoln Avenue, they made a shocking discovery that would answer a decade-long mystery but spark a new one. It cut to the sheriff's press conference. He spoke matter-of-factly while cameras clicked all around him. "The fire department responded to a 911 call around 5 p.m. last night. There was a gazebo on fire in the yard of the Murray residence. And when we assessed the damage, we discovered a bunker hidden underneath. Upon further inspection of the bunker, we found the body of a young woman and child. We've indeed confirmed the woman to be Mikayla Murray, but have no further information at this time." James squealed. "They found her?" I ignored him, my face sunken. Waitresses and patrons were noticing our panicked state. Something wasn't right. She'd been buried under there for so long, there shouldn't have been much to find. And a child? It is believed that Mikayla had been held captive inside the bunker since that fateful day 12 years ago. Until last night, when, tragically, both she and the child suffered fatal smoke inhalation resulting from the fire. Authorities have yet to confirm the identity of the child or who started the fire. Mikayla's mother, Linda, is being questioned by police, while federal officials search for her father, Paul, and brother James, both of whom are now missing. If you have any information on their whereabouts, please call this number and stay tuned for more on this story. I couldn't feel my body. I turned around and stared down at my shaking hands on the table, the world caving in on me. "What happened?" James cried. His breathing was heavy, his eyes bulging out of their sockets, staring at me bewildered. I finally looked at him. "I killed Mikayla."